Xena Warrior Princess and Buffy the Vampire Slayer are unquestionably two of the most iconic female-led action series ever produced. Xena is set in a far from historically accurate ancient Greece and follows its heroine's redemptive arc as she seeks, in the company of her sidekick Gabrielle, to make amends for her past misdeeds as a cruel warlord. Buffy, a supernatural series set in the fictional small town of Sunnydale, California, follows the exploits of its adolescent heroine as she balances schoolwork, family obligations, friendships, and romantic entanglements with her duties as the Slayer, mankind's greatest champion against the forces of darkness that roam the earth. Quite apart from their feminist credentials, the other significant factor that binds together the legacies of both series is their pioneering approach towards queer representation. Xena and Gabrielle, and Buffy's best friend Willow and her girlfriend Tara, comprise two of the most popular lesbian ships of modern times. Yet, whilst both series enjoy a similar standing from a feminist perspective, the LGBTQIA+ community all too often treats them as polar opposites. Whilst Buffy, through Willow and Tara, has come to be lionised as representing a landmark moment in queer representation on television, Xena is all too often lambasted, I can only assume by queer critics who have never actually watched the show, as nothing more than egregious queerbaiting. This video delves into the queerness that underlies both Xena and Buffy, investigating how and why so many of their characters were coded queer, as well as the extent to which this queering was intentional on the part of the actors and creative teams involved. In so doing, we're obviously going to need to grapple with the complicated histories of the terms queer coding and queerbaiting, to look beyond superficial definitions, and to properly examine both series in the context of the era in which they were produced. In their simplest form, queer coding and queerbaiting are not difficult terms to define. Queer coding essentially refers to a type of character construction in which characters may not be explicitly stated to be queer, but there is enough subtext available for an audience to read them as queer. Whilst this might sound straightforward enough, queer coding in practice may be open to a wide variety of interpretations and remains heavily dependent upon how such scenes are executed, the context in which they were crafted, as well as the intentions of the creative minds behind them. Queerbaiting, meanwhile, is an incredibly loaded concept, perhaps most succinctly defined as the incorporation of apparently gay characters or same-sex relationships into a film, television show, etc. as a means of appealing to gay or bisexual audiences whilst maintaining ambiguity about the character's sexuality. The cynical purpose behind queerbaiting, from a commercial standpoint, is essentially to throw queer audiences a bone, knowing they are so starved of representation that they will tune in droves. All of this, however, is done with absolutely no intention of ever bringing the relationships in question to fruition for fear of offending network executives, financial backers, or indeed the show's heterosexual majority audience. Classic recent examples of the practice include the titular heroines on Rizzoli and Isles, Stiles and Derek on Teen Wolf, Holmes and Watson on Sherlock, and Supergirl and Lena Luthor on Supergirl. In a film and television context, queer coding is really only necessary when openly queer representation is impossible. From a historical perspective, the practice arose out of the morally conservative censorship practices of early Hollywood in the first half of the 20th century, at a time when any inference of homosexuality, defined as sex perversion, was expressly forbidden. Since homosexuality was still treated as a mental illness in those days, it is hardly surprising that most queer characters were punched down upon in traditional Hollywood storytelling. Hence the sissy, a male character possessing overtly feminine mannerisms that cued contemporary audiences that he was gay without ever expressly saying so, was adopted as a source of cheap comic relief, to be laughed at by straight audiences for his lack of manliness. Villains, meanwhile, were often straightforwardly coded queer in order to heighten their villainy. And, most harmfully of all, characters of all stripes who were or were implied to be queer were all too often killed off at film's end, seemingly as righteous punishment for their degenerate behaviour, in an era in which the censorship guidelines of the Motion Picture Production Code, the Hays Code, explicitly stated that morally improper characters were required to get their comeuppance in order to prevent their idolisation. Sometimes, however, unintentional homoeroticism crept onto the screen almost inadvertently, whilst on other occasions queer writers, directors, and some of their straight allies actively sought to portray positive same-sex relationships on screen, whilst keeping matters sufficiently oblique that they enjoyed plausible deniability when running their films past the censors. Consequently, a whole host of films across Hollywood's golden age, whether intentionally or not, came to include what we would now call queer content. This was true, for instance, of films like Wings, Queen Christina, Rebel Without a Cause, and perhaps most notoriously, the Oscar-winning Ben-Hur, in which the film's gay screenwriter, Gore Vidal, convinced Stephen Boyd, the actor portraying the villain Masala, to play his initial relationship with Ben-Hur as if they were former lovers. This was queer coding as a positive substitute for the type of openly queer representation that simply could not be shown at the time. Sadly, although in hindsight unsurprisingly, the dismantling of the Hays Code in 1968 did not presage the arrival of an abundance of positive queer content. Rather, it entrenched the sissy as someone to be laughed at, and the queer-coded villain as someone to be feared and loathed. As a result, breakthrough films like Boys in the Band and Sunday Bloody Sunday were very much swimming against the tide, whilst the new queer cinema of the 1980s and 90s, although at last providing queer audiences with positive and wholesome representation that was specifically targeted towards them, existed well and truly outside of the mainstream. On television, meanwhile, positive queer representation was largely relegated to gay-themed very special episodes, whilst lesbians in particular were so grossly underrepresented that American television's first on-screen lesbian kiss didn't occur until an episode of LA Law in 1991. Consequently, by the time Xena and Buffy hit television screens in September 1995 and March 1997 respectively, there had only ever been a handful of lesbian kisses on American television and no meaningful lesbian relationships at all. This is the background that needs to be borne in mind when considering the queerness of both series, for it was in these unpropitious circumstances that both shows set about testing the waters of what was possible for same-sex relationships on television in the mid to late 1990s and early 2000s. Given the prevailing cultural climate of the 1990s, it is hardly surprising that Xena and Buffy each began their runs as nothing more than yet another straight show. Yet, as their feminist reputations underscore, both were, for the most part, incredibly progressive series for the era in which they were produced. Consequently, as early as their second and third seasons, around 1997-98, they were already pushing the boundaries of what constituted acceptable openly queer representation. Buffy famously developed the minor subplot that school bully Larry is actually in the closet, and although his arc from rampant sexual harasser of women to proud gay man in the space of a single conversation is rather clumsily handled by modern standards, there are aspects of his coming out experience that still resonate today, and which would have proven hugely fulfilling for LGBTQIA+ teenagers at the time. Even more impressively, Xena introduced one of television's first ever trans characters, or maybe a drag queen, it's canonically unclear, in an incredibly heartfelt story in which Xena goes undercover as a beauty pageant contestant and discovers that one of the finalists, Miss Artifice, is really a man. A revelation that is almost entirely not played for laughs, and in which Miss Artifice is granted her own voice to articulate why she feels more comfortable expressing her identity as a woman.
You really don't get it, do you? I guess being born a woman, you wouldn't. This is a chance to use a part of me most people usually laugh at. Or worse. The part I usually have to hide. Only here that part works for me.
Yet, significant though Larry and Miss Artifice were, there can be no denying the fact that it was the Xena-Gabrielle and Willow Tara relationships that have granted each series its iconic reputation within the LGBTQIA+ community. All four characters were, of course, appearing at a time when open lesbianism remained a heavily taboo subject on mainstream television. As a consequence, both shows were forced to rely upon subtext, upon queer coding in other words, to make it happen. They might, to cite our earlier definition, have been incorporating gay characters and same-sex relationships as a means of appealing to queer audiences whilst maintaining ambiguity about the character's sexuality, but in the context of the 1990s, this wasn't queerbaiting. The very notion of a mainstream television series actively seeking to win over a queer viewership was something entirely new, and it was the censorship restrictions of the era that limited the extent to which each series could follow through on its queer representation. So let's begin with Buffy, since it was, in some senses, the more straightforward of the two cases. Buffy always possessed something of a minor queer undertone, since its titular heroine's difficulties in hiding her identity as the Slayer was straightforwardly framed as an allegory for a closeted teen's coming-out story.
Honey, are you sure you're a vampire slayer? I mean, have you tried not being a slayer?
Mom.
It's because you didn't have a strong father figure, isn't it?
Do you think I chose to be like this? Do you have any idea how lonely it is? How dangerous?
It was, however, Buffy's best friend Willow who ultimately became the show's first major LGBTQIA+ character. Willow was canonically straight throughout the show's first 3 seasons. In mid-season 2, she gets her first real boyfriend, Oz, about as perfect as any man can be, who ends up leaving the series within the first few episodes of season 4. It was at this juncture that showrunner Joss Whedon came to actress Alison Hannigan and informed her that Willow would be getting a new and special friend in the form of fellow witch Tara. The idea of giving Willow a girlfriend, in other words, was carefully planned out by Whedon, arguably since late season 3, and was then meticulously put into practice. Tara made her first appearance on Buffy in December 1999 in the iconic episode Hush. What ensued was a classic case of queer coding, using magic as an allegory for lesbianism, much as the queer coding of old Hollywood had used various visual cues to hint to their audiences that certain characters were gay. Hence, by the end of Tara's first episode, she and Willow essentially interlocking their fingers as they perform a spell to escape pursuing demons. By their next episode, they are floating a rose whilst holding hands, all whilst romantic princess music swells in the background. By the episode after that, magic has become the show's coded language for physical intimacy between the pair.
I had so much fun the other night. Those spells.
Yeah, that was nice. I've been thinking about that last spell we did all day.
You have?
By Tara's 6th episode, their spellcasting has started being blatantly used to imply sexual intercourse, replete with sweating, heavy breathing, intense eye contact, and this. Even before her first episode is over, it is made abundantly clear that Tara is already falling hard for Willow, and that the two of them have a serious connection. Soon enough, Willow is constantly spending the night at Tara's, even though we only discovered this because her bed hasn't been slept in. And all the while, Willow is hiding Tara's existence from her friends in a manner that plenty of presumed heterosexuals coming to terms with the discovery of their same-sex attraction can readily appreciate. All of this culminates in the first scene between the pair that makes explicit what had thus far only been hinted at euphemistically.
I am, you know.
What?
Yours.
It is in Tara's 9th episode, however, New Moon Rising, that the Willow-Tara relationship decisively shifts beyond subtext and into the new and exciting realm of overt representation that only a handful of TV shows before them had traversed. The episode begins with the two of them strolling through the park holding hands and, ticking all the lesbian boxes, planning on getting a cat together. It features Willow having one of mainstream television's first ever coming out scenes, and as the episode's central dramatic arc, we have Willow at the centre of a bisexual love triangle, forced to choose between Tara and a newly returned Oz, and ultimately choosing the former. Thereafter, Willow's bisexuality was unfortunately erased, as Joss Whedon and his writing team, fearing that it might make her look indecisive, clung to the simplistic notion that suddenly she was gay now. For the most part, though, Willow's coming out journey was handled with considerable delicacy for the time. Yet, for all the show's positive intent, one giant taboo remained: the censoring of physical intimacy. In an otherwise largely progressive piece of television, New Moon Rising's happy ending, which, in any heterosexual relationship, would have culminated in a kiss, instead merely ends with the blowing out of a candle, hinting euphemistically at what was about to happen next. And this is what makes the Willow-Tara relationship so fascinating from a historical perspective, and demonstrates just what precarious new ground the show's writers were breaking. What had been done with Willow and Tara across season 4 would never have been permitted on television a mere 5 years earlier. Yet, displays of physical intimacy, beyond cuddling and meticulously painting each other's backs for some reason, remained a bridge too far. Consequently, throughout the first half of Season 5, the magic metaphor was persisted with, most overtly in the show's first Tara-centric episode, in which her conservative family's disapproval of her use of magic is adopted as a straightforward allegory for a negative coming-out story, overcome by the acquisition of a found family. Yet even here, in the episode's final scene, a tender moment at Tara's birthday party once again concludes with witchcraft standing in for actual physical intimacy. Only in the 16th episode of Season 5 do Willow and Tara at last get their first kiss, a kiss that was fought for long and hard by both actors Alison Hannigan and Amber Benson, and by showrunner Joss Whedon, who threatened to resign if it wasn't greenlit, and who essentially got it on screen because it was a kiss of emotional support in a time of grief, rather than an explicit expression of sexual intimacy. Or, put more cynically, they had to kill off Buffy's mum and have Buffy find her body in order to momentarily make two women kissing appear like not quite such a big deal. This status quo, however, was soon to change. In a monumental move for the show, Buffy transferred from the WB network to UPN. With its protagonists now 3 years out of high school, Season 6 sought to adopt a more adult tone, moving away from the show's original branding as a supernatural teen action drama. The magic metaphor was persisted with for one iconic sex scene in the show's musical episode, but throughout most of the season, magic was, rather clumsily in my view, transformed from an allegory for lesbianism into one for drug addiction, as the season focused upon how Willow's addiction to powerful magic undermines her studies, damages her friendships, and temporarily ends her relationship with Tara. Perhaps unsurprisingly, UPN proved just as conservative as the WB network when it came to censoring portrayals of lesbian intimacy. Nonetheless, Season 6 showrunner Marty Noxon continued pushing the envelope, utilising the show's more generally adult tone to depict the Willow-Tara relationship with increasing forthrightness. After Buffy dies in the Season 5 finale, Willow and Tara move into her home, share a double bed together, and effectively become her younger sister Dawn's surrogate gay mums. When they break up and Tara moves out, Dawn behaves entirely like a child of divorce having a justifiable meltdown. Tara even has private milkshakes with Dawn in the style of a single parent getting their one weekend a fortnight. And when Willow and Tara get back together towards the end of the season, we finally get the tender, passionate kissing and lovemaking that had virtually never before been seen between a same-sex couple on American television. Indeed, late season 6 may be considered utterly groundbreaking in its normalisation of lesbian intimacy, not least when Dawn discovers Willow and Tara post-coitus and has a reaction that is utterly wholesome and very 2024. Sadly, as every Buffy fan knows, this long-awaited moment was swiftly followed by one of the most problematic examples of the bury your gays trope, as Tara is needlessly killed off so that Willow, following another tired lesbian cliché, can psychotically avenge her whilst fully turning towards the dark side. Yet, it says so very much about how far social mores on television had evolved in just a handful of years that during Buffy's final season, which aired in 2002-3, Willow and her new girlfriend Kennedy faced none of the censorship restrictions that Willow and Tara had faced only 3 years earlier. Willow and Kennedy share their first kiss right from the outset of their relationship, and by the show's final few episodes, the two of them are not only shown making out almost as a sidebar, but are granted the series' first and only explicit lesbian sex scene, in which the sex itself is neither euphemistically portrayed through magic, nor skipped over entirely. In its proper historical context, Buffy's queer coding of the Willow-Tara relationship through magic from mid-season 4 has come to be appreciated for what it was, a means of getting past the censors, whilst the coming out episode, the found family episode, the cuddles, the emotional intimacy, the kisses, and ultimately the sex scenes became flagship moments heralding the direction that queer representation on television would take in the 21st century. So, if the Willow-Tara relationship is so fondly recalled a generation after Buffy ended, why is the same not true for Xena and Gabrielle's relationship? There are several points of difference between the two series that make plain precisely why Xena was never able to be as explicit with its queer content as Buffy. Most obviously, Xena began a year and a half earlier, and only briefly were the two shows thriving conterminously. Xena was already halfway through its penultimate 5th season when Tara was first introduced on Buffy, and by the time the Willow-Tara relationship was in full bloom, Xena was heading towards its final episode. Even more importantly, Xena was a syndicated series, with its producer, Rob Tappert of Renaissance Pictures, hawking the product to local and national networks whilst remaining reliant upon advertisers and a handful of key sponsors. When considering the queerness of the Xena-Gabrielle relationship then, what ought to be emphasised is intentionality. As a syndicated series in the mid to late 1990s, Xena was in no position to include openly queer characters on its show. What made the series groundbreaking and positive for the LGBTQIA+ community was that when Xena's showrunners, staff writers and stars discovered early in season 1 that they had a legion of queer fans, rather than being repulsed, they actively embraced their unexpected fan base, skirting the expectations of networks and advertisers in much the same manner that Buffy, a few years later, would use magic as an allegory for lesbianism. It's also worth emphasising, as one further point of departure between the two shows, that the Willow-Tara relationship was carefully planned out in advance by Joss Whedon, whereas when Xena first aired in September 1995, nothing of the sort was even remotely contemplated. A taste of the conservatism showrunner Rob Tappert and his writers were forced to deal with may be gleaned from the fact, firstly, that Tappert was strongly advised when pitching the series simply to make Xena male, and secondly, that when the first episode was released, censors and local advertisers voiced concerns over the opening credit sequence, since it featured Xena getting intimate with the shirtless warlord Draco, and it was feared that his long braided hair might lead audiences to conclude that Xena was in bed with a woman. Yet, despite the fact that Xena's early episodes were never intended to be anything but straight, they inadvertently came off as incredibly queer. Right from the outset, Gabrielle is heavily coded as a baby gay. Feeling utterly trapped by her dull peasant existence, Gabrielle yearns for excitement and adventure and longs to see the world. Yet the way she expresses this to Xena entirely gives off the vibe of only gay in the village staring down the barrel of a heteronormative life she doesn't want. In scene after scene across the show's first few episodes, the Xena-Gabrielle dynamic enjoys a decidedly romantic undertone, even as their writers felt compelled to push boyfriends of the week upon both characters. All of this came to a head in episode 8, in an inadvertently deeply romantic scene as Gabrielle tearfully farewells Xena right before she departs on what appears to be a suicide mission. Actors Lucy Lawless and Renee O'Connor have always claimed that it was around this point in the show's run that they first became aware of their lesbian fan base, as they rapidly found themselves inundated with fan mail from queer women of all ages, at the same time as an abundance of Xena-Gabrielle femslash began appearing online in the early days of the internet. To their lasting credit, both stars, alongside producer Rob Tappert, enthusiastically jumped at the chance to please their new and unexpected demographic. As we shall see in the final section, they sometimes missed the mark, but on the whole, they proved remarkably successful in respecting their queer fan base whilst maintaining plausible deniability with the censors, networks and advertisers whom they needed to appease in order to sell the series. What resulted was a noticeable shift in the tone of the Xena-Gabrielle relationship across the back half of Season 1. Despite intermittently continuing to thrust boyfriends of the week upon both characters, the show's inner core of staff writers took note of the warmth, affection and intimacy that had originally won over their queer viewership and began integrating these types of scenes into their stories with increasing frequency. Just as importantly, the intimacy Xena and Gabrielle began displaying towards one another did not exist in a vacuum, as little droplets for the benefit of queer viewers, but was instead used as a genuine form of character building to reinforce the show's central message that neither protagonist can contemplate life without the other. When, for example, Xena is struck by a poisoned dart and Gabrielle thinks she's dead, she kisses her a fond farewell, has a furious, grief-stricken breakdown over her death, and then risks her own life to prevent Xena's body from being torn limb from limb. And, in even more iconic fashion, when the tables are turned in the season finale and a wounded Gabrielle seemingly dies in Xena's arms, we get an incredibly powerful acting moment from Lucy Lawless as Xena's stoic warrior facade entirely crumbles upon the realization that she might have lost Gabrielle. Thereafter, Xena's writers became ever more emboldened in making the Xena-Gabrielle relationship the centrepiece of the story, growing the implied love and affection between their heroines to the point that by mid-season 2, in the episode The Quest, Xena and Gabrielle at last share their first on-screen kiss. This episode, it should be noted, aired in February 1997, almost exactly 4 years to the day before Willow and Tara's first kiss on Buffy. And yes, the kiss took place with Xena inhabiting the body of Autolycus the Thief, played by Bruce Campbell, but we nonetheless get to see Xena and Gabrielle in the spirit world leaning in to lock lips, immediately preceding a hard cut to Gabrielle and Autolycus, leaving the viewer in absolutely no doubt as to what was actually going on. In essence, the Xena-Gabrielle relationship was no longer subtext. Xena had unequivocally kissed Gabrielle romantically, albeit to appease networks and financial backers, in the body of a man. And as the series progressed, other similar excuses were concocted to enable the pair to express their physical intimacy whilst maintaining the necessary plausible deniability. The Quest proved a line-in-the-sand moment for Xena and Gabrielle's relationship. Only 2 episodes later, in the light-hearted A Day in the Life, their behaviour makes plain that they are now unquestionably dating and are very much in the honeymoon phase. They can't keep their hands off each other, they bicker like an old married couple, they enjoy decidedly unplatonic baths together, and they even repeatedly bemoan the fact that men keep crushing on Xena.
Another one's fallen for you.
Again? Why does this always happen?
It's the blue eyes, the leather. Some guys just love leather. You know, her boyfriend is in love with you. Guess I'll have to straighten that out, too.
Why you?
Because I do the sensitive chats.
From here on in, the series makes no bones about the fact that one giant rift and a few ill-conceived boyfriends of the weaker side, Xena and Gabrielle are in a canonical romantic relationship throughout the rest of the show's run. Indeed, within the limits of the conservative censorship guidelines they were forced to work with, Xena's writers went out of their way to highlight the physical and emotional intimacy of their leads' relationships with each other, and with other women, in a manner that really cannot be read as wholly platonic unless you're the kind of person who has a see-no-homo mentality. This was done, it should be emphasised, not to queerbait, nor to keep the heterosexual male viewer engaged, but rather to queer code for the benefit of the show's substantial lesbian audience, who were the driving force behind the packed Xenacons that became enormously popular during and in the years immediately following the show's run. It's abundantly clear, moreover, that cast and crew alike were entirely on board with what was going on between its leads. When, for example, Xena falls pregnant in Season 5 and is confronted by Ares, god of war, we get this.
I wish I'd known you were looking for a father.
I'm not.
Oh? Well, somebody clearly got the job.
Yeah, Gabrielle.
When a male suitor inquires if Xena is interested, this is Gabrielle's response.
Does Xena ever think about settling down and getting married?
No, she likes what I do.
And, beyond each of these examples, there's this notorious ad-lib from the beloved Groundhog Day episode, Been There, Done That, concocted by Lucy Lawless right before the cameras rolled.
It's not the fates, it's not Ares, it's not something I ate. No, I have no poison dart marks. I have no Buckeye bites.
Is that a hickey?
Indeed, if there were any doubt as to the show's intentions, one need look no further than this incredibly frank interview with actor Ted Raimi, who played our heroine's comic relief sidekick, Joxer. When asked during Season 3 about the nature of Joxer's relationship with Xena and Gabrielle, Raimi pulled no punches.
Joxer's always curiously ignorant about their sexual relationship. And I'm certain he's never seen them without their clothes once. Sure, they tell him, Joxer, go to the hill, 5 miles, take a hike, and then come back. Throughout the show, he's kind of blissfully, curiously, stupidly unaware of what's happening with those, their relationship.
Importantly too, the series didn't simply celebrate their lead's relationship via veiled hints of physical intimacy, which would have really smacked of queerbaiting. Its writers also persistently emphasised their emotional connection as well. In the Season 2 episode Blind Faith, for instance, Gabrielle is kidnapped whilst Xena is splashed in the face with a poison that slowly begins turning her blind. Despite knowing where to find the antidote, Xena sets off in the opposite direction with failing vision to save Gabrielle, prepared to face an otherwise avoidable lifetime of blindness to keep her safe. And 2 seasons later, with the shoe on the other foot, Gabrielle renounces the pacifist traditions she had been following all season in a desperate bid to save Xena's life, and then, as they endure crucifixion at the hands of the Romans, we get this.
You were the best thing in my life.
I love you, Xena.
Their souls even ascend to heaven together in an overtly romantic epilogue. This style of subtextual storytelling, deliberately bordering upon text, reached its apogee, however, in Season 6, as Xena's writers, seemingly let off the leash by the knowledge that it was their final season, developed a substitute romantic language for the couple centred upon their official status as soulmates, and which proved every bit as blatant as the use of magic for Willow and Tara on Buffy. Season 6 is widely regarded as the most sophisticated season of the show. It was now the early 2000s. A syndicated series like Xena still couldn't risk being entirely explicit about its queer content, but changing times at least allowed them to be much more overt about it than had been permissible in the mid-1990s. And boy, does it show. In episode 3, the nature of their relationship is explicitly spelled out for the first time.
You're a mortal female with a lying tongue, savage tendencies, and a blonde girlfriend.
3 episodes after that, Gabrielle's dying wish is to be buried alongside Xena rather than her own family. In the alternate timeline episode, When Fates Collide, in which Xena and Gabrielle have never met, their love for one another proves so strong that it transcends and ultimately breaks the spell that has been cast, reconstituting the original timeline. And in Many Happy Returns, our heroines spend the entire episode scandalising a delightfully prurient young virgin sacrifice they've rescued. All the while, Gabrielle keeps fangirling over the playwright Sappho, with the tale concluding with an epilogue in which, as her birthday gift, Xena presents Gabrielle with a poem she got Sappho to personally pen for her. The most overt expression, however, of the extent to which subtext had become text was to be found in the 3-part story arc known as the Ring Trilogy, in which the writers took a stab at Norse mythology, with Xena and Gabrielle battling Odin and his Valkyries. In this iteration, the young Valkyrie Brunhilde completely falls in love with Gabrielle and remains utterly devoted to her and bitterly jealous of her feelings for Xena. Eventually, to prove her love, Brunhilde transforms herself into an eternal flame and cocoons Gabrielle in an enchanted sleep. Countless men attempt to set her free, but only Xena, Gabrielle's true love, is able to walk through the flames and wake her with a sleeping beauty's kiss. There can be no clearer indication than this that Xena was not a queerbaiting show. Like Buffy, with its use of magic early in the Willow-Tara relationship, it was forced to use allegory and implication to portray a relationship that dare not speak its name openly to censors and advertisers. Buffy was ultimately granted the opportunity to be completely open about its queer content. It was being broadcast on a mainstream network, and by its middle seasons, Joss Whedon had become one of the highest profile TV showrunners in Hollywood, possessing considerable clout to get his own way. Xena, by contrast, was a syndicated series, filmed in New Zealand, shot by a niche production company, and which was anyway a season ahead of Buffy at all times, and thus that much closer to the social mores of the mid-1990s than those of the early 2000s. Episodes like The Quest, A Day in the Life, and the Ring Trilogy, however, make plain that Xena's actors and creative team were every bit as committed to their lesbian fanbase as their counterparts on Buffy. As we shall see a little later on, both series on occasion succumbed to actual queerbaiting. Yet, within the context of the era in which they were produced, it is abundantly clear that this queerbaiting was accidental rather than malicious in intent. One of the chief complications when examining queer coding and queerbaiting is the simple fact that absolutely anyone can be shipped. Within the Buffyverse, for instance, certain fans heavily ship Giles and Spike in Season 4, when they spend much of their time bickering like an old married couple. In the same season, a well-worn fan theory exists that the reason Riley Finn's best friend Forrest is so opposed to Riley's relationship with Buffy is because he is closeted and secretly in love with him. And on Buffy's spin-off Angel, plenty of fans perceive overt sexual tension between Angel and his adversary Lindsay MacDonald, and view their morally grey relationship via a queer lens as leaning heavily towards the enemies to lovers trope. Whilst everyone should be free to ship whomever they choose, it is abundantly clear that none of the above ships were even remotely intentional on the part of the showrunners and writers involved, and represent complete fabrications by viewers reading between the lines in search of queer content. This is something queer audiences, historically starved of images of themselves, have been doing since the earliest days of film. There would doubtless have been plenty of LGBTQIA+ teenagers, for instance, who came away from films like Wings or Queen Christina ready to handwrite a 1,000-page fanfic, fleshing out in their imaginations the same-sex relationships that were only hinted at euphemistically on the screen. When it comes to Xena and Buffy, what complicates our appreciation of the series' queer content is that whilst some ships existed only in the imaginations of queer viewers, and one or two at the opposite extreme eventually became canon, there remained a variety of queer-coded characters who occupied a sort of middle ground, in which nothing about their sexual identity ever moved beyond subtext, but in which it was clear that the writers and/or the actors themselves were deliberately hinting at the possibility of same-sex attraction. Given the nature of Golden Age Hollywood, in which those likeliest to be coded queer were villains, it is hardly surprising that it was amongst the series' cohort of antagonists that queer coding was most often adopted. Examples of such characters include Xena's one-time nemesis, the warlord Cortez, the wicked Amazon shaman Alti, and the Emperor Caligula, brilliantly played with a genuinely frightening level of psychotic camp by the late trans actor Alexis Arquette some years prior to their transition. And perhaps most prominently, there's the overt relationship between the goddess Athena and her general Elenus, a bond so intimate and painted with such mutual affection that despite their status as villains, one genuinely feels Athena's sorrow when Xena kills Elenus in battle. In the Buffyverse, meanwhile, classic examples of queer-coded villains include the Gentleman from Hush, Glory's chief minion Jinx, and Darla and Drusilla over on Angel. Rarely, however, did Xena and Buffy adopt queerness straightforwardly as a shorthand for villainy and leave it at that. The effete mannerisms of the Gentleman, for example, were undeniably adopted to make them appear especially terrifying, but unlike a lot of other queer-coded villains, it was clearly never the intention to draw a straight line between male effeminacy and psychotic behaviour. Indeed, most of the time, the queering of villains on Xena and Buffy actually helped open up new dynamics for them and make them more sophisticated and interesting. It is heavily implied, for instance, that Darla and Drusilla, alongside Angelus and Spike, back in their evil vampire days, were very much a quad. Giles' nemesis, Ethan Rayne, to cite another prominent example, is never expressly portrayed as gay in the writing of the show, but actor Robin Sachs absolutely played him in the style of the Masala-Ben-Hur relationship cited earlier, as if he and Giles had been lovers when they were young, and Ethan rather wishes Giles wasn't such a goody two-shoes so that they could possibly rekindle what they once had. It's worth pointing out, too, that sometimes certain actors just have an undeniably queer vibe to them on screen, and enjoy tremendous natural sexual chemistry with same-sex screen partners, regardless of their own or their character's sexual orientation. The quintessential modern example of such an actress is Katie McGrath of Merlin and Supergirl fame, and within the Buffyverse it is unquestionably true of Wolfram and Hart attorney Lila Morgan on Angel, whose actress, Stephanie Romanov, enjoys incredibly steamy chemistry with almost every woman she interacts with. Some of her scenes feel deliberately queer-coded by the writers, others feel much more inadvertent, yet equally palpable. Unquestionably, though, the two villain characters who were most overtly and deliberately coded queer were Xena and Buffy's respective nemeses, the blonde warrior woman Callisto and Buffy's fellow slayer Faith. Callisto was a small child when Warlord Xena sacked her village and burned her family alive. Everything Callisto does is consequently motivated by the desire to avenge herself upon Xena, even as she butchers countless innocents in pursuit of her single-minded goal. She doesn't just want to kill Xena, she wants her to suffer the same emotional anguish she had felt, and thus homes in upon killing everyone Xena loves, from Gabrielle to Xena's mother, to the son she gave up for adoption, and even to her beloved steed, Argo. Faith, for her part, is essentially Buffy's road not taken, the cynical slayer she might have become without friends and family as a support network to help her carry the crushing burden of her destiny. Faith begins her run on the show genuinely seeking to fit in with Buffy and her friends and fight by Buffy's side. Yet, as the season progresses, Faith comes to feel ever more isolated, unloved and unappreciated, which drives her towards increasing recklessness, culminating in her accidental murder of an innocent man. Instead of taking responsibility for her actions, Faith hides the body, attempts to pin the murder on Buffy, and eventually takes a decisive turn towards the dark side, allying with the villainous mayor of Sunnydale, who, in his own twisted fashion, becomes the loving parental figure she had always yearned for. And beyond even this, what sets Callisto and Faith apart from almost every other villain across both series is the fact that theirs is a redemption arc, and by the time their final episode arrives, both have conquered their proverbial demons and become genuine allies to the show's heroines. From a queer perspective, however, what makes Callisto and Faith so fascinating is their overtly queer-coded relationships with Xena and Buffy. Even at their most wicked, they seemingly cannot decide whether they want to kiss or kill their adversary, and one gains the distinct impression that they'd rather like to do both simultaneously. Callisto, for her part, never expresses the slightest sexual attraction towards anyone else, male or female. Yet, when it comes to Xena, the one-way sexual tension emanating from Callisto is palpable. When, for example, she escapes the ancient Greek equivalent of a supermax prison at the start of her second episode, the first thing she does is order her henchmen to lug her giant bondage chair with them so that she can strap Xena into it at the first opportunity. When she and Xena get trapped in quicksand later in the same episode, Callisto appears ecstatic at the prospect that they might die together, allowing them to spend all eternity in each other's company. In the show's musical episode, it is Callisto who acts as Xena's guide on her Alice in Wonderland-style dreamscape, teasing her mercilessly whilst at the same time crawling all over her like someone trying to initiate foreplay. Indeed, as perhaps the most pertinent illustration of Callisto's literal love-hate relationship with Xena, when Xena finally kills her, well, we'll just let the scene speak for itself. In essence, Xena is Callisto's obsession, an obsession rooted in bloodthirsty vengeance, yet simultaneously swimming in sexual tension. And although Faith's relationship with Buffy has more ebbs and flows to it, precisely the same type of romantic and sexual tension pervades their interactions as well, with the noticeable difference that it is even more overt and deliberate. From their very first episode, Sarah Michelle Gellar and Eliza Dushku's chemistry and body language make plain just how much Faith is into Buffy, and potentially just how much Buffy is into Faith. The intimacy of their relationship evolves rapidly. By their third episode, Faith is casually asking Buffy out on a supposedly platonic date to the school dance. A couple of episodes after that, not only are they slaying vampires in glorious unison, but Buffy is openly joking about them being a couple. Raising the bar a step further, their reconciliation in the season's Christmas episode, after a brief falling out, is portrayed through the writing, acting, and background music as deliberately romantic, almost as if Buffy had invited her new girlfriend over for Christmas dinner. And, as Faith's arc continues, regardless of whether she and Buffy are, at any given moment, friends or enemies, Faith's attraction to Buffy remains so intense and explicit that it goes well beyond subtext, bespeaking an unconfirmed but painfully obvious unrequited love that just fuels Faith's petulant hostility towards Buffy as she turns towards the dark side. All of this, it should be emphasised, was not merely the fevered daydreaming of same-sex attracted viewers desperately perceiving queerness when it wasn't there. Both Hudson Leek and Eliza Dushku have confirmed in subsequent interviews that they deliberately played up their characters' sexual tension with the show's titular heroine. Indeed, despite Joss Whedon's protestations to the contrary, other Buffy writers, notably Douglas Petrie, have likewise confirmed that they were heavily invested in the Faith-Buffy ship. So much so, in fact, that in one notorious scene in the episode Enemies, Faith was purportedly due to kiss Buffy on the lips at knife point, before censorship concerns saw it downgraded to a kiss on the forehead. In essence, Callisto and Faith provide two different shades on the queer coding spectrum. Callisto's attraction to Xena is heavily intertwined with her hatred of her, and although certainly ever present in Hudson Leek's performance, remains largely confined to the realm of subtext. Faith, by contrast, is actively portrayed as being in love with Buffy, even as she simultaneously resents and envies her. Whether all of this comprises queerbaiting represents an equally important question to which we shall turn in the final section. So, beyond the high-profile cases of Xena and Gabrielle, Willow and Tara, and Callisto and Faith, how effective was Xena and Buffy's writers more generally in avoiding the well-worn queer stereotypes that Hollywood had been peddling since its earliest days? The most common of these were probably the old-school sissy character and his female equivalent, the butch or tomboy. The sissy, as we have seen, was an effeminate gay stereotype, noticeably disinterested in women, sometimes obliquely interested in men, but often portrayed as a kind of asexual other. The butch or tomboy, meanwhile, was generally portrayed as a sexual predator, luring virginal young straight women into her sordid way of life. Both stereotypes, to varying degrees, remain alive and well in modern Hollywood, and Xena and Buffy, perhaps unsurprisingly, contained iterations of both types of characters. Perhaps the most egregious examples of the trope are to be found in very minor characters who, due to their lack of screen time, never move beyond inadvertently homophobic cliché. A Season 1 episode of Xena, for instance, features a mincing, pampered prince who spends all his time cattily bemoaning Xena's lack of feminine accomplishment and preference for masculine heroics. And, at the opposite extreme, a Season 5 episode of Angel features a butch lesbian prison guard stereotype via a character, granted no dialogue, whose entire job appears to be to strip captured female werewolves naked prior to their transformation before giving them a vigorous scrubbing down. At the same time, there were several characters played by well-known LGBTQIA+ actors, such as Alexis Arquette as Caligula, or Jack Plotnick as Alan, the Deputy Mayor of Sunnydale, who, like many an old Hollywood sissy, are never explicitly stated to be gay, but are strongly hinted at being so. Then there's the fascinatingly unexplored queering of two members of the Harmony Gang in the Buffy episode Real Me. Harmony's minions, Peaches and Cyrus, are absolutely coded as a lesbian and her gay best friend who got vamped, presumably on their way home from Sunnydale's only gay bar. Much more significantly, on Xena, there's the recurring character of Xena and Gabrielle's friend Minya, who is first introduced as a local peasant woman and Xena's biggest fan, and is later revealed in a plot skirting the line between subtext and text to have left her boyfriend Hauer, joined an acting troupe, met the woman of her dreams, and come to a certain very special realization.
In fact, the two of you made me realize something deep down about myself that I guess I always knew but just didn't dare admit. Yes, I'm a lesbian. Oh.
And of course, beyond each of these examples, there's everyone's favourite demon cabaret singer, Lorne on Angel, played by the late Andy Hallett, who is really coded very much in the style of the suave gay best friend who was all the rage in rom-coms at the time. Lorne treats all his beautiful female friends as platonic gal pals, good for a laugh and a margarita, all whilst flirting outrageously with Angel at every given opportunity, in a manner so overt that it was quite clearly intentional on the writer's part.
Love the code. It's all about the code. Welcome to Caritas. You know what that means? It's Latin for mercy. Smart and cute. See you around. How fabulous would I look in that coat?
Arguably, though, from a queer perspective, the best and worst examples of such characters across the Xena and Buffy verses are respectively the prissy etiquette instructor Vidalis on Xena and the fascinating, albeit I would argue deeply problematic, redeemed villain Andrew Wells on Buffy. Vidalis was only in a single episode of Xena, but he proved an impressively subversive character by the standards of mid-90s television. Superficially, he was the quintessential old-school sissy, the heir to every costumier and guy from the decorating company in old Hollywood movies. When Gabrielle is kidnapped and forced to marry an elderly king as part of a plot by the king's first minister to seize the throne, Vidalis is tasked with transforming Gabrielle into a real princess so that the members of the royal court will approve their engagement. What ensues is the campest possible version of ancient Greek My Fair Lady, as Vidalis spends the entire episode driven to distraction by Gabrielle's peasant muscle and inability to correctly wear heels or perform a passable curtsy. Yet, as the tale reaches its climax, Gabrielle recognises in Vidalis a kindred spirit, that is, reading between the lines, a fellow gay. What we get is a delightfully queer meeting of minds.
Have you ever been in love, Vidalis? Huh? I mean, really in love?
Well, there was a certain someone.
Now, when you think of that person, can you imagine being with anyone else? And now you know how I feel. I can't marry the king because my heart belongs to another.
By episode's end, Vidalis has switched sides and helped Xena and her companion Palamon rescue Gabrielle. Best of all, in the epilogue, we get this.
You know, he and I dealt with those guards quite handily. I think I might follow him and see if he needs a sidekick.
You know, it's pretty good work if you can get it.
Bye!
Impressively, the writers entirely avoid the easy option of playing this potential team-up for laughs. Like the tolerance displayed towards Miss Artifice in the beauty pageant episode, it's all treated in a very wholesome fashion for the time, and implies that Palamon and Vidalis might well become genuine friends and make an excellent hero-sidekick combination. The same, sadly, cannot be said of aspiring big bad Andrew Wells on Buffy. Andrew was 1/3 of the trio, the least intimidating and I would argue least interesting villains of Buffy's entire run. Essentially, Season 6 of the show witnesses Andrew, alongside fellow incel nerds Warren and Jonathan, deciding to use their scientific and mystical acumen to take over Sunnydale and become supervillains. Unlike every other big bad the series produced, all three are portrayed as completely unlikable. They're not even the kind of villains you can love to hate, and this was very obviously the intention. Yet their behaviour is beyond insufferable. All they ever do is bicker about Star Wars, James Bond, board games and comic books, lest the audience for one brief moment forget they're nerds. Their every interaction is straightforwardly intended to make them appear as pathetic as possible, so that Buffy's audience can laugh at them for their extreme nerdiness, whilst groaning at their Big Bang Theory-style misogyny. From a queer perspective, however, what makes the trio's portrayal even more disheartening is the fact that Andrew's very obvious homosexuality is entirely treated as a joke. Andrew is blatantly implied to be in unrequited love with Warren, and either deeply in the closet, or perhaps not even quite aware that he's gay. Even though Tom Lenk is a charming actor, what makes Andrew so disappointing, in Season 6 especially, is that his coming out journey could have been integrated into his wider character growth, and could have been shown to have impacted the choices, good and bad, that he makes along the way. Instead, Andrew's gayness is straightforwardly made the butt of the joke, from his dress sense and his taste in alcoholic beverages to scenes like these.
Guys, we have to... Oh, holy crap. Oh my god. Is that Spike? He is so cool. And, I mean, the girl's hot too. Ooh, hey. Here's something I think you're going to be interested in, gentle viewers. Look at the fine work Xander did on replacing that window sash. You can't even tell it's new. It blends in so well. He's extraordinary.
Indeed, what ought to have been a serious dramatic moment for Andrew, as he sheds tears of heartache upon realising that Warren never loved him and was just using him, is instead framed in such a manner that the audience is simply encouraged to laugh at him because he's in love with a man. This is precisely how the sissies of old Hollywood were written, to be laughed at by straight audiences for their supposed abnormality. It should be emphasised, of course, that none of these failings were the result of deliberate or malicious homophobia on the part of Buffy's writers. Like the old-fashioned racist jokes and the marginalisation and misrepresentation of BIPOC characters that percolate the series, it simply arose because Buffy's writing team were creatures of their time. In the same way as they uncritically embrace the painful Chinese potential Slayer can't speak English joke, they embrace the sissies are inherently funny because being gay is hilarious joke, even as they simultaneously subverted queer stereotypes on so many other occasions throughout the show's run. So, in light of all this, where does the vexed issue of queerbaiting fit in? For amidst all the good intentions of both series, it's quite obvious that what we would now categorise as queerbaiting did take place on occasion. When considering why this occurred, it's important not to draw any black and white distinctions between positive and negative forms of queer representation. These days, it's easy to point to a show like Rizzoli and Isles and hold it up in damning contrast to something like Wynonna Earp. But really, to understand what was going on Xena and Buffy, a more pertinent comparison might be with the CW's Supergirl. Supergirl remains something of a paradox in the realm of queer content. On the one hand, it took the deliberately progressive step of making Supergirl's Earth sister, Alex Danvers, gay. In one of the show's best-written subplots, Alex gets a belated coming-out story in her late 20s, when, to her surprise and confusion, she falls head over heels in love with out-and-proud lesbian police detective Maggie Sawyer. Before long, Alex faces up to some home truths she had been burying about herself since her adolescence, after which she and Maggie briefly became one of television's queer power couples, known by the ship name Sanvers. Simultaneously, however, Supergirl's writers were queerbaiting the hell out of its titular heroine's relationship with Lex Luthor's sister Lena, ship-named Supercorp. The treatment of the Kara-Lena relationship comprised a classic example of queerbaiting at its worst. Their every interaction involved intense eye contact, intimate light physical touch, going on supposedly platonic lunch and dinner dates, expressions of romantic love that were then played off as gals just being pals, romantic music playing in the background as they flirt, and, most egregiously, Supergirl repeatedly rescuing Lena in scenes that deliberately aped the Superman-Lois Lane relationship, though with none of the follow-through. If this weren't enough, members of the show's cast, foremost amongst them Jeremy Jordan, even publicly mocked Supergirl's queer audience for being so heavily invested in the Lena-Kara relationship, essentially taunting them that it was never going to happen, whilst implying that the sexual tension they were enthusing over was all in their heads. This was the inverse of the way Xena's showrunners, writers and stars reacted to the discovery of their queer viewership over 2 decades earlier. Yet, in other respects, the two shows were remarkably similar, in that both simultaneously rewarded and insulted their queer viewership through their writing. Whilst Supergirl's writing staff created one major lesbian relationship, then seemingly patted themselves on the back whilst trying to make the rest of the show as heteronormative as possible, Xena's creative team was trying to make Xena and Gabrielle official, despite being unable to say so, yet in their efforts to code them as queer, they intermittently came up with scenarios that from a modern standpoint comprised pure queerbaiting at its worst. This was most apparent on those occasions when physical or emotional intimacy between its leads was straightforwardly teased and denied to the point that it almost felt like a taunt. In the Season 1 episode Altered States, for instance, the episode begins with a panning shot over Xena and Gabrielle's discarded clothing on a riverbank, followed by a deliberate inference that Xena is teaching Gabrielle cunnilingus, before, in a veritable gotcha moment for the viewer, it's revealed that she's actually teaching her how to fish instead. Later in the same episode, Gabrielle is drugged and high as a kite, at which point this happens.
What is it?
You are beautiful.
Uh-huh. And you are drugged.
In the extremely queerbaity Season 3 episode, Fins, Femmes and Gems, suggestive bathing, sexual double entendres, and fake-out kisses are all in evidence. We even get this egregious moment, with Gabrielle under a spell in which she has fallen in love with her own reflection.
And then you pulled me up and I looked into your eyes and Xena, I finally realized there can only be one person for me in my life. Me!
And perhaps worst of all, in the Season 2 finale, A Comedy of Eros, Cupid's baby son has been running amok, shooting people with arrows that cause them to instantly fall in love with the first person they see. Sadly, when Gabrielle is struck, we get this incredibly queerbaity fake-out, implying that Gabrielle is about to lay eyes upon Xena in her love-struck state, only for Joxer to reassert heteronormativity by stumbling in between them at the very last moment. Each of these may be considered classic examples of queerbaiting, hinting that Xena and Gabrielle are at last going to verbally or physically express their love, only to have the rug pulled out from under the queer viewer at the very last moment. The reason these scenes feel so queerbaity is because they are not integrated into Xena and Gabrielle's wider character growth. Moments like those in The Quest, A Day in the Life, One Against an Army, or the Ring trilogy, are pivotal to the wider characterization of both protagonists, and despite the use of coded language, these moments, in a very real sense, help to grow their relationship. In these queerbaity examples, by contrast, everything exists in isolation and feels like a detached nudge and wink moment that doesn't achieve anything more than teasing the queer viewer with what they cannot have. Yet, despite the problematic nature of such scenes, I would argue that unlike the queerbaiting of Supergirl and Lena Luthor, or for that matter Rizzoli and Isles, there was no real duplicity or ill intent involved. Xena was one of the first ever series to overtly and positively engage with a queer audience, and its writers were doing so at a time when modern terms like queerbaiting, queer coding, queer catching, etc. simply did not exist in the popular lexicon the way they do today. It seems far likelier then that these queerbaiting moments were intended as queer coding, along the same positive lines that we have already encountered. But without any clear guidelines as to how to go about it, the show's majority straight writers were feeling their way and quite simply got it wrong on occasion, in so doing inadvertently engaging in what we would now call queerbaiting. In essence, the reason I would argue that the Xena-Gabrielle relationship rarely queerbaited, and when it did it was usually accidental, is because the overwhelming majority of the time the show's writers and stars were quite clearly pushing the relationship hard to the very limits of what contemporary networks would allow. In this sense, the writing on Xena comprised a longer term and more clumsily handled version of what Joss Whedon and his writing staff accomplished on Buffy, with lesbianism straightforwardly coded as magic for Willow and Tara in seasons 4 and 5. Yet, if the Xena-Gabrielle and Willow-Tara relationships were, for the most part, well handled, when it came to other, more subsidiary characters, queerbaiting was much more in evidence, essentially because the groundwork hadn't been laid to establish a genuine, long-term, romantic or sexual attraction between the couples in question. Consequently, a warm hand on the shoulder, doomy eyes, cuddling, bathing, etc. really could feel very exploitative, even though it probably wasn't intended to be. On Xena, this was perhaps most overtly true of one of the series' most beloved queer ships, Evaria. This was the ship name granted to a pair of later season recurring characters, Xena's adult daughter Eve and the feisty young Amazon warrior Varia. When our heroines visit the Amazon lands, Eve and Varia hit it off right from the start and are soon testing each other's combat skills in the most flirtatious manner imaginable, by examining and caressing each other's battle scars whilst sharing long, lingering looks. It was this single flirtatious scene that launched the ship, yet there was absolutely nothing else to it. Varia is antagonistic towards Eve for much of the rest of the episode, and this is the only Varia episode in which Eve appears. This makes the overt and deliberate sexual tension that infuses their initial interaction feel decidedly queerbaity, since there is absolutely no follow-through, leaving their flirtatious training sequence feeling like all promise and no fulfillment. The same aspersions could be cast at plenty of queer-coded relationships from the Buffyverse too. In a crossover episode of Angel, for example, the show's writers, very much in the style of the Eve-Varia relationship, make the bizarre creative choice to have Willow and her Angel counterpart, Fred Burkle, flirt outrageously with one another at every given opportunity. This was done despite the fact that Fred had never previously shown the slightest intimations of same-sex attraction, and never would again, and that Willow, at the time, was dating potential Slayer Kennedy over on Buffy. This one-off queering of the Willow-Fred relationship fails at every level. Not only does it ignore the sexual histories of both characters, it inadvertently plays into the homophobic stereotype that Willow might turn Fred gay, or at least into something other than straight. It panders to the ridiculous notion that since Willow and Fred are structurally the same character on their respective shows, that is, the shy and awkward nerd with tremendous courage and a towering intellect, that somehow this makes them the perfect romantic match. And, perhaps most troublingly, it leaves the queer viewer with the distinct impression that Angel's writers felt that Willow's primary character trait, beyond being a witch, was her sexual orientation, and that therefore her exotic attraction to women needed to be placed front and centre for the benefit of any Angel fans who didn't watch Buffy. The preeminent example of queerbaiting within the Buffyverse, however, was to be found in the much-shipped Buffy-Faith relationship alluded to earlier. Whilst the ship itself is very interesting, and, as a form of unrequited love on Faith's part, has plenty to recommend it, the actual devices by which their relationship was coded queer by the writers have not aged particularly well. We now know that nothing physical or romantic ever eventuates between Buffy and Faith, nor is Faith's near-canonical bisexuality ever directly addressed, not even when she returns to the show in Buffy's final season, by which point Willow was out and proud and same-sex attraction was no longer taboo. So doesn't this deafening silence make Faith and Buffy's overtly queer-coded scenes together in early season 3 feel decidedly queerbaity? I mean, let's just compare the Christmas dinner scene cited earlier to a notorious example from Supergirl that is often upheld as a classic instance of modern queerbaiting.
So my office is overflowing with flowers.
Really?
Yeah. You didn't have to do that.
Yeah, I did. Supergirl told me that it was you who sent her. I don't know how to thank you.
Well, that's what friends are for.
Yeah, never had friends like you before. Come to think of it, I've never had family like you. No one's ever stood up for me like that.
Now you have someone that will stand up for you, always.
Well, Supergirl who saved me, but Cara Danvers, you are my hero.
Thank you. Anytime. Hey. Hi. Looked like that whole party thing was gonna be kind of a drag. I didn't really have anything, you know. Glad you came. Here.
Why don't you come in from the entire lack of cold?
That one is for your mom. They're pretty crappy.
Faith, you made it. Oh, that is so thoughtful.
They're crappy.
From the awkward flirtatiousness of their body language, to the long lingering looks they give each other, to the deliberately soft romantic music playing in the background, to the intimacy of their dialogue, there is nothing platonic about either of these scenes. In short, if Lena and Kara's interaction deserves the label queerbaiting, then surely so too does Buffy and Faith's. And theirs, moreover, is far from the only Buffyverse relationship to which the queerbaiting label could be applied. The same claim could arguably be made about Angelus and Spike, or indeed about Darla and Drusilla. Yet, just to illustrate how thorny this issue can become, the above Darla-Drusilla scene from Season 2 of Angel feels decidedly less queerbaity in light of a brief flashback sequence in Season 5 that all but confirms the quad nature of the Angelus-Darla-Spike-Drusilla relationship. In short, intentionality and historical context are the key. Popular knowledge of what constituted queerbaiting simply did not exist in the late 1990s and early 2000s the way it does today. There were far fewer openly LGBTQIA+ characters on television, and queer content was much more aggressively censored. Indeed, for all their faults, the veritable cornucopia of queer characters in the Arrowverse on the CW network underscores just how far we've come in terms of representation, whilst other, much more explicitly queer shows, like Lost Girl or Winona Earp, have taken the type of positive content pioneered in the new queer cinema of the 1980s and 90s, and have adopted it to the action genre and made it mainstream. Against this backdrop, both Xena and Buffy may be considered landmark series that helped pave the way for the type of positive queer representation that abounds today. In both cases, their actors, writers and producers enthusiastically embraced their queer fanbase in defiance of contemporary social mores. We know for a fact that Buffy openly worked to cultivate one of television's first prominent same-sex couples, growing Willow and Tara's relationship in the face of considerable network opposition as it evolved from queer coding into openly queer content. Xena, meanwhile, as a syndicated series which began a year and a half earlier, never enjoyed the opportunity of taking this final step. Its cast and crew, though, were wholeheartedly on board with the queerness of their lead's relationship and overtly portrayed it within the limits of what was possible. The clearest example of authorial intent in this regard comes in Xena's two-part finale, when the writers concocted a paper-thin excuse for Gabrielle to have to pass magical healing water to Xena in her mouth, allowing the two of them to share what both actresses portrayed as a lingering, passionate kiss, thereby creatively circumventing networks and advertisers, whilst giving their high-profile lesbian fanbase what they had been yearning for 6 seasons. Indeed, long after the show ended, Lucy Lawless and Renee O'Connor even acted out a fan-scripted marriage proposal between Xena and Gabrielle at the 2012 XenaCon, in front of a cheering throng of predominantly LGBTQIA+ fans, making their allegiance to the character's queer identity perfectly clear, whilst acknowledging the role this demographic has played in keeping the series' legacy alive. When all was said and done then, the fact that both Xena and Buffy went from being completely straight when they began to being as openly gay as possible by the time they ended serves as a reminder of the extent to which queer content on American television underwent a literal sea change between the mid-1990s and early 2000s. Xena began with networks and advertisers fearing that its heroine in bed with a long-haired man might be mistaken for lesbianism. By the time Buffy ended, Ellen had come out and been cancelled, Frasier was dealing with gay storylines with considerable sensitivity, Will and Grace, for better or worse, had provided television with its first modern, openly gay sitcom star, and Queer as Folk was pioneering positive, specifically queer-centric representation on a mainstream network for the very first time. When placed in this historical context, there can be no doubt that Xena and Buffy, with their positive queer coding and at times openly queer representation, were both on the right side of history. If you enjoyed this content, I'd recommend checking out my new book, Hollywood's Women of Action, From the Perils of Pauline to Wonder Woman, which examines the development of the action heroine as a character from the silent screen era to the present day. It's available from Amazon and other international booksellers. To purchase, follow the link in the description below. And if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, comment and subscribe.